Someone once told me, and this has stuck through my whole career, utilities have millions of users, but just one customer, and that's the regulator.
Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to State of Energy. And today we have with us Alex Thornton, Executive Director of LF Energy. Alex, it's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
It's my pleasure to host you here today. And you recently joined LF Energy as the Executive Director. There's so much to talk about, but I want to start with your own career graph. Talk a bit about yourself and what attracted you towards LF Energy that you joined the foundation.
So my career has always been focused on how can I make an impact on climate. Um, and that started the journey actually in Europe working on energy policy. So working with the European Commission to set minimum energy performance standards for things like lighting, cable set-top boxes, power and distribution transformers, and overall energy efficiency policy analysis. From that, I went to utility scale solar, and then started getting into tech, moved to San Francisco, joined a startup, and basically grew in technology, working on solar analytics, virtual power plants, and everything in between. So I have this background with energy and climate policy and technology. And after working in technology development and startups and private companies for a while, I realized I wanted to do something to lift up the entire industry. And that's where LF Energy and open source comes along. There's so much opportunity to leverage open source foundations to accelerate the energy transition. We're not moving fast enough. And the energy system is digitizing rapidly, but not really adopting the modern best practices in open source that you see in other sectors. And so that's an opportunity, and I'm really thrilled to be working on that with LF Energy.
What kind of challenges you see that are unique to energy sector that would traditionally make it harder for them to collaborate?
Someone once told me, and this has stuck through my whole career, utilities have millions of users, but just one customer, and that's the regulator. Right. So, I live in San Francisco. PG&E is my utility. Um, they really are accountable only to the regulator who approves their strategic plans and their electric rate cases. And so they're not competing for my business necessarily. And that's very different from a lot of other industries, right? We're dealing with regulated monopolies. And there's a reason that it's evolved in this way. There are some benefits to that. There's some drawbacks. The regulator is traditionally hyper-focused on safety, reliability, cost efficiency. And the incentive structure has evolved such that, utilities tend to make a guaranteed rate of return on certain types of investments. And therefore, that's what they tend to be incentivized to pursue, like large capital investments. And what's happening is the sector is rapidly evolving because we have decarbonization goals. You have a proliferation of carbon-free energy resources that tend to be variable in nature, right? Solar, wind, they're distributed, they're not centralized. And then also you have an explosion of electric load growth. And this is very, very recent. Even up till 10 years ago, expected load growth was flat. We weren't growing our electric load. We were becoming more efficient. We were installing LED light bulbs and more efficient refrigerators. But with the rise of electrification and electric vehicles and heat pumps and data centers, electric load is really exploding. And so you have utilities that find themselves in a challenge and regulators who find themselves in a challenge where we can't actually build our way out anymore. We can't build enough wires fast enough and cost efficiently enough to solve problems the way we used to. But the incentive structure isn't yet there to operate more efficiently. And so that's one of the major challenges of how do we get the major entities involved in this energy transition to be appropriately incentivized to embrace new ways of doing things that optimize our investments and properly optimize the physical infrastructure that we already have.
One more thing that is happening with the energy sector is that renewables. Everybody has solar. They also have EVs. So we are now putting a lot of load on the grid when we are charging our EV. At the same time, we are sending electrons back because we are generating electricity at home as well. How has that also added to that complexity?
It's exponentially increased it, right? And instead of having a centralized one-way flow of electricity from a large central power plant going over transmission lines through a distribution grid and being consumed at the edge in your house, my house, you have now a distributed system, distributed generation, distributed consumption, and the load on the edge, electric cars, heat pumps, electric hot water heaters, is larger than it was previously. Like an electric vehicle is almost like adding another house's load to the grid. But it's also flexible, right? You can make decisions about when you want to charge. And that's a very powerful concept, because as we have variable generation, we had an eclipse in the US a few days ago. What happens when there's a solar eclipse is solar production goes way down. And so then as a grid operator, you have two choices. You can either find alternative sources of generation, typically natural gas peakers, which are expensive and dirty, or you can reduce consumption. And with increased flexible grid edge loads, we have more power to reduce consumption and control that to match the generation. And so that's an asset, but it's also incredibly complicated. It's a much more data-driven optimization, real-time IoT sensors. It's almost as if utilities are becoming a digital network overlaid on top of the physical one. And that's a very new concept.
What are the challenges or pain points that the energy sector has identified to be a priority that they are working on? Of course, we are going through this whole energy transition. Decarbonization is also going on there, where we see these are the areas that they want to start with. And then let's also talk about how LF Energy is coming into the picture to also create a platform where most of these, RTE, Elianda, they are a good example. Two different countries, different kind of industries, but they are now working together. So let's talk about what are the areas that the sector wants to solve first, and how LF Energy is kind of enabling that.
So there are a number of areas that there is active progress on, which is really heartening. One area is we effectively have transmission congestion, right? Transmissions are the highways of our electric grid, and oftentimes there's a traffic jam. We can't send more power through them. And this isn't necessarily due to a physical reality. It's often due to we historically take a very conservative approach to the carrying capacity of our electric grid. Assume the worst, and therefore it's going to be safe. But what that does is it leaves a lot of room for optimization. And so there was recently an order from FERC, FERC Order 881, which said, hey, transmission system operators need to share transmission line rating data, so that inevitably, like the goal is to be able to squeeze more capacity out of the existing transmission lines. And that's a great step in the right direction. So we're not necessarily taking this overly conservative approach, but taking a more data-driven approach. And one of our, recent open source projects is called Trolley, and it's an open source implementation of that order, contributed by GE and MISO. So it creates an API specification for facilitating that data sharing. And so that's an area where you have clear policy direction, and it's being translated into an open source specification that's having a real tangible impact.
Can you also talk about the role open source can play in this space, because open source in reality is less about code and actually more about collaboration, building a kind of community. That is the biggest pain point. So talk about how open source can also be a catalyst to the change that energy sector is looking at.
The good news is the energy and power sector has a a rich tradition of collaboration already through organizations such as the IEEE, IEC, and other standards bodies. Throughout its lifetime, there's been collaboration around, okay, are we going to align on 120 volts or 240 volts, right? 50 hertz or 60 hertz. And so there's a vast library of standards that are the results of this collaboration. That's fantastic. Open source has the opportunity to complement the sorts of collaboration that already exist, because what happens is you end up having collaboration and creating a standard, and that standard often takes the shape of, okay, you now have a PDF document, maybe a couple hundred page, who knows, but there are ways to interpret that standard. And you may have organizations interpreting that standard in different ways, which leads to duplication of effort, basically different flavors of the standard, reducing interoperability. And so I think that's an area where open source has a real potential to reduce friction and reduce duplication of effort, because we can actually create the reference implementation for the standard. One area that we're making progress on this is, so there's a IEC 61850 standard around digital substations. And that's, fairly mature standard, very, well regarded and implemented throughout the world. But you end up having different interpretations of the standard. And a few of our projects, such as Compass and OpenSCD, they provide a reference implementation for parts of the standard so that organizations can align around this and then customize on top of it, rather than have to build it all from scratch.
If you just look at LF Energy and your goal, of course, there is code to be written, and you mentioned a lot of projects there. There are specification, standards, and there's also to work with policymakers, government. So which of these three are kind of within the radar of LF Energy, or is all three?
I think all three, because they all go hand in hand. As I said before, the utilities, the customer, like, they are accountable to the regulator. So part of our job at LF Energy is making sure that policymakers and regulators are aware of the potential of digitization and open source, and how it can make our grid operate more efficiently, how it can make it more secure, how it can reduce investment costs. Because at the end of the day, the policymakers and regulators need to buy into that, for utilities themselves to be comfortable pursuing that as well, because they need to go to the regulator and say, hey, we're going to invest in open source and digitization efforts. If the regulator isn't already aligned with that, then they're not going to get their rate case approved. So that's kind of working with government, working with regulators is an important pillar. Working with utilities, who end up, they're the ones who are managing the electric grid. They're an important pillar. And then technology providers. Oftentimes technology isn't being developed directly within the utility. Especially within the US, there aren't often large R&D teams. They work with their vendors to develop and deploy technology. And so if there isn't a robust vendor ecosystem around open foundations, then utilities aren't even going to have a chance to procure that. And so we need to be working with all three.
When we talk about regulations and policymaker, can you also talk about, do you also, LF Energy, all the industry also work with some of those bodies so that we are totally in alignment with where the industry is heading, where the world is heading, so that rules and regulations also kind of on par with that?
there's a spectrum. There's a lot of work that feeds into regulation eventually being produced, right? There's research that goes into it. There's policy analysis that goes to it. There are industry, lobbying groups, and so part of our role is to get upstream. Work with, for example, researchers at the Department of Energy National Labs that are creating some of the research studies that feed into the opportunities and challenges with digitization, for example. Working with some government bodies that hand out grants, right? They provide funding for software development. How can we do it in a way that fully leverages open source for the public good and ensures a long shelf life beyond just the funding timeline? So we're definitely getting involved in that respect to generate the research and the content that feeds into the policy and regulation making process. And it's a multi-year effort, right? This isn't an area that moves fast. So we're patient and we're thoughtful, and we're very collaborative because it requires us all working together.
Can you also talk about, if you folks, since we are talking about policies and regulations, are you folks also working on any event to bring all these policymakers together?
So we have an Open Sustainability Policy Summit coming up May 2nd and 3rd in DC. We're hosting that in partnership with Johns Hopkins University. And the intent of that is to gather the various stakeholders, policymakers, regulators, private industry, utilities, everything in between, around how policy and open source can work in alignment in achieving our energy sustainability goals.
What is your strategy for this year? What are the challenges you're looking at, kind of, once again, addressing for the industry? I just want to understand, just to get a glimpse of the things that we can look forward that LF Energy will be doing this year.
We have three main objectives for this year. The first and foremost is really engaging with North American utilities and policymakers, regulators, and the vendor ecosystem. It's an area we already have fantastic membership and engagement in Europe from RTE and Alliander. And we see North America as just an opportunity for us to add another tool to the toolbox in terms of energy digitization, accelerating the energy transition there. So we're working hard on developing that. Another area that we're actively developing is the open EV charging ecosystem. We happen to be throwing another event for that also in May 15th and 16th in Dallas. In partnership with TI, we're hosting an open EV charging summit because EV charging doesn't always work. I think 1 out of 4 charging sessions fails. And as we make a very aggressive, urgent move to electric vehicles, it's a very important policy goal for the U.S. government. So we're working with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, but also private industry. We're building out these electric vehicles, and we need a place for them to charge. And then the last goal we have is really to build out data standards. We have a carbon data specification consortium, which is trying to reduce friction in accessing data required to understand progress towards decarbonization goals or the content of green hydrogen, all sorts of efforts. Basically, we have very ambitious decarbonization goals that require data-driven proof. And it's hard to get that data right now. And so we are working with folks like Google, Microsoft, Utility API, and building out open source specifications for that, and really driving the industry towards more of a data-driven approach.
Alex, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about, of course, the large picture of the energy sector. And also, once again, congratulations for joining the foundation. And I look forward to talk to you again soon. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.